Hi, I'm Dr. Bryan Babcock, and I have the honor of being one of your Viking resident historians. And today, it is really my honor to be able to be with you on Viking.TV and share one of my personal favorite stories, and that's the mystery of King Tut. And there are so many aspects to this story that have intrigued people over the course of time. First, this story is a narrative about untold riches. It's really a story about the first and only royal tomb in the history of Egypt that has ever been found intact. And that means that we're able to learn much about what it meant to be Pharaoh, what it meant to have an afterlife, and what types of artifacts went with these great kings into the next phase of what Egyptians thought was the next phase of life, that death wasn't the end. Death was merely the beginning of a new phase. And as we look at these untold riches, it really tells us about wealth and gold. In fact, in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, you'll see the innermost sarcophagus for King Tut, and that's nearly a 500-pound solid gold sarcophagus. But it also, we learn about jewelry, and we learn about different types of amulets that pharaohs and kings were buried with, from lapis lazuli to glass to precious stones to gold, you'll see in the upper left-hand corner. And then they had wooden boxes that had gold inlay and different stories told upon them. And that's what you see in the center. Here we see King Tut with his queen as she rubs oil on his arms and as she talks to him. So this story talks about the mysteries of unimaginable wealth. But it's also the story of three relatively unknown and unremarkable individuals. King Tut, while we think of him as the greatest pharaoh of all time, was a nobody. He is a guy who became king at the age of 9. And when he became king, it really was a period of religious upheaval, economic upheaval, and military weakness. That during the end of this 18th dynasty, King Tut comes into a reign of turmoil. And he only lives for 10 years. So he makes small changes, but really under the tutelage of his regents. And then we have on the right-hand side of your screen, Lord Carnarvon. And Lord Carnarvon is a royal member, or at least a wealthy member of the British aristocracy. And yet he accomplishes very little in his early life. He marries well. That's a great start. He has a beautiful home that we'll talk about. But he is in an auto accident. He is sickly. He is crippled. And so he is not someone who we would see as a leading figure in an adventure narrative. And then finally, we have Howard Carter in the middle of your screen. And Howard Carter is an illustrator and an artist. He is someone who, for most of his life, has wanted to be an archaeologist. But his personality has gotten in the way, and he ends up with difficult relationships. He's had some digs, but they've not been incredibly successful. And so when these three join together, each of them is really rather unremarkable. And yet, when they come together, they change history. And they find the one tomb in all of archaeology, in all of Egypt, that actually is fully stocked with artifacts. So while each individually is unremarkable, when they come together, they accomplish greatness. And so I want to tell you a story of these three men and how they come together to change the history of the world. First, we have Howard Carter, and Howard Carter is born in 1874 in a suburb of London. So he's British born, and as he becomes a student, he is rather poor. He's not able to excel in school. He's not going to be able to go to college. But he meets a woman who lives close by, and her name is Lady Amherst. And she lives in a place called Didlington Hall. And she brings Carter in, and she recognizes that he has this talent as an artist and an illustrator. And she has several Egyptian artifacts. And so she lets him into her artifact room and asks him to draw some of the items that she has procured. In doing so, he falls in love with Egypt, and she recognizes his talent. And she works with her connections so that at the age of 17, he is able to go to Egypt and join with other archaeologists and begin to record what they are doing. Now, archaeology up to this point in the late 1800s is really more treasure hunting than it is the archaeology that we know today. Most of the archaeologists are not really there to record history. They're there to find stuff. And Carter is on the cutting edge of a new type of archaeology, one that is not just about finding artifacts. It's really the ability for them to go in and preserve and record history for all time. And what that means is that as they dig and as they uncover all of these tombs and temples and religious sites, that they want to draw everything that is on the walls, because they begin to recognize that as you do a dig and you expose all of these ancient inscriptions to the air, all of a sudden they begin to fade over the next few years. So the best time to record is actually as they begin to do the archaeological work. And Carter is on the forefront of that. So at 17, he joins this British-sponsored archaeological survey of Egypt. And he is assigned to Queen Hatshepsut's temple. And that's at Deir el-Bahri. And so when he goes in, and you can see some of his art here on the screen of Hatshepsut, and we call her Queen Hatshepsut, and yet she was one of the most important pharaohs, kings of Egypt of all time. She rules for over 20 years. She conquers nations. She's the daughter of a prominent pharaoh. And when she's young, he actually takes her off to war and trains her how to be a general. As she grows up, her half-brother becomes Pharaoh, and she marries him. When he dies, she actually takes over as king for 23 years. And so for many out there, we think of Pharaoh and we think of Egypt and we think of kingship as really a male-dominated idea. And yet in Egypt, there were as many as possibly 13 women who became the king of Egypt. Hatshepsut was one. So kind of back to our story, when we look at Howard Carter, he is assigned to her temple, and he begins to record all of the items that she has. And he does this from 1893 up until about 1899. But in 1898, there is a freak rainstorm. And this is a part of the desert that just does not get any rain. And so when all of this rain comes down on these mortuary temples, damage begins to erode some of the art on the walls. And so in 1898, Carter is asked to move from Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahri down to a little village called Medinet Habu, where Ramses III Mortuary Temple is located. And they ask him to spend a few months recording all of the iconography that is on the walls. Now, to do so, that would mean that he needs to move from his area, where on that right-hand graph you see a red arrow. That's Deir el-Bahri. And then if you follow the main road down to the left, you'll see Ramses III's temple at Medinet Habu. So as Carter is moving back and forth on his horse between the two locations, one afternoon, he's moving home from Ramses III Temple at Medinet Habu. He's following the road to the north, heading back home, and his horse stumbles where you see that red arrow. And he falls off his horse, and as he's getting up, because of all this rain that has come down recently, some of the gravel and dirt has been moved away, and as he puts his hands down, he looks at his hands, and he sees a stone step. Now, Carter has been in love with this idea of treasure hunting and archaeology, and even though he's been assigned as an artist, he wants to be an archaeologist. And so as he looks down and he sees this step, he thinks to himself, I have found perhaps a tomb of someone, and no one has seen this step before. And he approaches Theodore Davis. Theodore Davis is a wealthy financier. He is the prominent archaeologist in southern Egypt. And in fact, the Valley of the Kings is his domain. Theodore Davis is the only archaeologist who is allowed to be able to dig at the Valley of the Kings. And this isn't the Valley of the Kings. This is just about a half a mile away from the Valley of the Kings. But he approaches Davis and he says, if you'll pay for this dig, I think there is something underneath this step. If you'll give me some workmen and you'll let me be the lead archaeologist, I will work under you and I will learn from you as we go in and explore. And Davis is moved. Davis looks at Carter and says, this is someone who is in his 20s who I think I can help make into one of the next great archaeologists. But while Carter loves history and Carter loves art, Davis is all about the stuff. Davis wants to find tombs and wants to find temples that have artifacts because Davis sees this as a money-making venture. Anytime Davis finds things, he gives some of it to the Egyptian government, but then he sells roughly half of whatever he finds to wealthy investors who want their own collections or to museums. So he is seeing archaeology as treasure hunting, while Carter is seeing archaeology as history. But they come together and work in this Deir el-Bahri location to see if they can find tombs and stuff. Well, as Carter begins to dig, he gets lower and lower on these steps, and he finds doorways into tombs that are classified as the tombs of the nobles. So he knows he doesn't have a king's tomb here, but he has a tomb of somebody who is very important. And as he approaches the doorways, it looks like no one has been here before. And as he gets to the doorway, he finds the seals that actually closed it originally are still intact on the doorway. He examines around the edges of the door to see if perhaps someone has broken through the stone doorway and has perhaps raided the tomb before. And yet when he looks, It doesn't look like anyone's been here. And he brings Davis down and he shows him these stairwells and the doorways. And Davis is equally convinced that these tombs have not been disturbed in the past. I mean, just imagine their excitement. No one has ever found a tomb intact. No one has ever found stuff that where all of it was there. There might be a piece here, a piece there, or a chariot or a bull, but not gold and not amulets and definitely not all the sarcophagus. And so both become incredibly excited that on the back side of this door could be something that changes history forever. And Davis gets so excited that he begins to send telegrams to the Egyptian government and to governments back in England, and all the important people of both countries converge so that they can be present when these two archaeologists change the world. And the day comes where Davis and Carter are standing at the doorway with everyone with them, and they open the doorway to find absolutely nothing. Imagine the embarrassment that you have hyped this up, that we have found a tomb that is going to have riches beyond imagination, and you open the doorway and there's nothing there. And Davis is embarrassed and completely irate. Davis cuts off the funding and engages a different archaeologist as his dig manager, firing Carter. Now Carter looks inside and says, look at how beautiful these tombs are. And look at the walls. Look at all of the inscriptions and the drawings and our understanding of the Book of the Dead and the afterlife. And Davis will have none of it because Davis didn't want to learn history. Davis wanted stuff. And so we find that Carter at this, kind of intermediate point in his career, he is a good artist. He is a great illustrator, and he's learning archaeology. But as the country looks at him, he really is a guy who has failed. But as we move into that 1901 to 1905 period, he does get a job with the government. He becomes the Inspector General of the Antiquities Department. He's able to be part of various digs. As we look back at the Valley of the Kings, he, at least in a superficial way, is involved in the finding of Hatshepsut's tomb, not her mortuary temple that he had worked on before, but her actual burying place in the Valley of the Kings. And that was in 2003. He's also able to be part of the team that found Ramses II's son's tombs. And by the way, this is a tomb that has 150 different chambers, different rooms, as it's dug into the Valley of the Kings. And in that Ramses II's son's tombs, they did find some chariots and some other golden items. So he is beginning to create a name for himself again. However, the word on the street is that Howard Carter is arrogant and sarcastic. And so people aren't really wanting to work with him, but because of his position with the government, he is at least allowed into their circles. And then we have something known as the Saqqara affair. In 2005, some French tourists were looking at Saqqara, which is just south of Cairo, and they get into a scuffle with some of the Egyptian guards. And the Egyptian guards treat them rather brutally. And the French government demands action. And as the head of the Antiquities Department, Carter is sent to investigate. Was it the French tourists who were acting badly, or did the Egyptian guards overreact? And Carter analyzes what takes place, and he sides with the Egyptian guards and says that the French were really out of line and that the Egyptian guards were just protecting the site from what these French were trying to do. And the French government is irate that, in fact, Carter did not side with them. And they demand that the Egyptian government fire him. And the Egyptian government fires Carter. So in 1905, Carter has first found a tomb, but built it up to be something that it wasn't, and is fired. He goes to work for the Egyptian government, but because of his arrogance and his sarcasm, he's on weak grounds. And then because he sides with the Egyptian guards in a skirmish, he's fired again. So here is a guy who really is going nowhere. He has moments of brilliance, but can't get out of his own way. And so in 1905, he is unemployed. And then we have the second person in our trilogy as we talk about our story, and that's Lord Carnarvon. And his name is George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, and he is the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. And he's known really for being born at Highclere Castle. And why is that important to us today? As you look at this picture, you may notice that this is the site. Highclere Castle is where Downton Abbey was actually filmed. And so to our claim to fame, Lord Carnarvon was born in Highclere Castle, which is Downton Abbey. He was the only son of Henry Herbert, who was the 4th Earl of Carnarvon. And Henry is known for being a distinguished Tory statesman. He's also known for being under a pile of debt. If we look back to the late 1800s, many of the nobility in England were land rich and cash poor. They had immense land holdings and these beautiful large castles and country houses, but they didn't have the income necessary to support both the lavish lifestyle and the large tracts of land that they had under contract. So when Lord Carnarvon becomes Lord Carnarvon, he is essentially broke. He has all of these houses and all of this land, but all of the debt that comes along with it. And he's actually considering selling all of the houses that he has, except for Highclere Castle, and trying to get out from under the piles of debt. When he meets Almina, and Almina Victoria Maria Alexandra Womwell is a wonderful young woman from the United States. And he meets her, and as happens at this time in the period of British history, many of the nobility are able to bestow a title on a wealthy woman from the United States in order to have access to her funding. And for those who have seen Downton Abbey, that's exactly what happens in the story. And you'll be perhaps surprised to see that as we look at this story of Lord Carnarvon, there are actually several points that are copied into Downton Abbey. And the first is that he marries a very wealthy woman. Now, Almina does not have a last name that you'll recognize, Womwell. However, she is the illegitimate daughter of millionaire banker Alfred Rothschild. And so while she is a black sheep of the Rothschild family, she has an amazing endowment. And when Lord Carnarvon marries her and makes her Lady Carnarvon, the Rothschild family gives him the equivalent today of $50 million. In addition, they pay off all of his debt. So now he is debt-free, land rich, and flush with cash. So he has changed his circumstance dramatically by marrying Almina. And like the story of Downton Abbey, he actually loves her. This is not just a marriage of convenience, it is actually a marriage of love that gives him tremendous wealth. So what do you do with all of this found money? Well, he is somebody who we would call an early adopter, that this is a technological age. So examples of that is right off the bat, he buys one of the first best photo cameras that can be found. And he does that because he's adventurous. He wants to record new things. He wants to try new experiences. Another thing is the automobile is just now being invented. And he not only buys automobiles, but he buys a race car. So he's adventurous. He wants to try these new things. And in fact, there is one story that I read about his past where after he gets this race car, he is just speeding down the road, and a policeman pulls him over and cites him for reckless driving and speeding beyond belief. And the ticket records that he was going 25 miles an hour. So race cars at that point aren't necessarily going amazingly fast, but he likes the idea of pushing the limits. Unfortunately, in 1901, he has a serious accident in Germany, and it leaves him crippled. And when he talks to his doctors say that these British winters are going to be incredibly hard on you, that you need to find a warmer, drier climate to spend the winters in order to combat arthritis. And so part of his move to Egypt over the winters is really to convalesce from this Germany accident that he has in his race car. He also loves speed and breeding, and in 1902, he established Highclere Stud to breed thoroughbred racehorses. And in 1905, he was appointed one of the stewards of the new Newbury Racecourse. And the Carnarvon family, his family, has maintained the connection ever since. His grandson, the 7th Earl of Carnarvon, was racing manager to Queen Elizabeth from 1969 until his death, and the Carnarvon family has maintained close relationships to the royal family ever since. But as we look at Carnarvon in 1902, he moves to Luxor to convalesce from the car accident. And this becomes his annual winter tradition. And in that, he meets Davis. And Davis tours him all around the Valley of the Kings. And Davis has 2 or more tombs to find. That Davis feels that in the Valley of the Kings, that King Horemheb and King Tutankhamun may very well still be in the Valley of the Kings. And one of them or both of them might be that elusive tomb that is still intact and has never been found. So Davis shows Carnarvon several of the artifacts that he's been finding on his recent dig. And a few of them mention the name of King Tutankhamun. And Carnarvon is intrigued. He wants to know more. He wants to find out what else could be found by being an archaeologist. And as kind of a layman, he decides that he would love to be an archaeologist, and he has money, so he goes to the Egyptian government. And he says to them, give me a site, give me a chance. I'll hire 100 workmen, and I will dig wherever you think is appropriate, and I will actually pay you for the right to dig. And the Egyptian government says, well, here's this wealthy guy who is willing to give us money in order to do a dig. And they point to this spot over in Western Thebes and they say, all right, if you want to dig, see that pile of dirt? We actually think there might be something in or under that big pile. So why don't you hire workmen and you go be an archaeologist and see what you can find? And so for the winter in 1905, Carnarvon starts to dig and he supervises 100 workers and they're all going different directions. Now, it really is more treasure hunting than archaeology, but he's having a great winter season. And at the end of it, at the bottom of this pile, he finds something. He finds a cat. A mummified cat, but a cat. And so most people would say, here I have spent in our money $100,000 over the winter. I've hired 100 people to work, and what have I found? A cat. And yet for Carnarvon, he looks at it and says, here I spent the entire winter, and what did I find? I found a mummified cat. How cool could that be? And he is really invigorated. And now he really wants to be an archaeologist because he could find a mummy. Now it's a mummy of a cat, but he found it. And he was able to show something. He made a difference in history. And so we come to a chance encounter that actually changes the world. Carter and Carnarvon meet at a function held by Davis. Now, Davis has continued in these 1903, 1904, 1905, and into 1906. He has continued to dig and he has found not a huge amount of things, but he has found this jar. And he believes that inside this jar is going to be something spectacular and that it will lead him to future discoveries. And in classic Theodore Davis style, he has this elaborate dinner party where he invites all of the archaeologists, all of the artists, and all of the notable people working in that southern Egyptian realm to his house for the grand discovery and uncovering of what is in the jar. And so after dinner, they get together and Carnarvon and Carter are at the party and Theodore Davis opens the jar only to find some mummified wrapping paper. And he again is rather embarrassed that he's had this party, but one of the outcomes is that Carter and Carnarvon become friends. But one of the other things that happens, which becomes important to the rest of our story, is Davis closes it up and says, the jar is worthless. Send it to the Met. And maybe the Metropolitan in New York will be able to look at the jar and determine if it has any value whatsoever. And he sends it to the Metropolitan. Essentially, the Metropolitan looks at it and says, we'll get to it in a few years and we'll let you know. But Carter and Carnarvon come together and say, perhaps we will be able to do something together as archaeologists to change the world. And this is a quick video that we have showing the beginning of the work together out of Western Thebes between Carter and Carnarvon. Now they're wanting to be able to dig in the Valley of the Kings, but the Valley of the Kings is the sole domain of Davis. So they have to work in other Theban sites, and they do find a few things together, but nothing really of significance. But for the next few years, they work together as archaeologists and form a very good team. In 1908, Davis finds the tomb of Horemheb. Horemheb was a mighty general. He didn't rule for very, very long. And when Davis finds this tomb of Horemheb, it's empty. Now, after years of trying to find Tutankhamun, King Tut's tomb, Davis feels that it's just not there. That if Tutankhamun was in fact there at one point, his body was moved and that tomb was used for something else, or perhaps because he died so young, he never had a tomb. And so he concludes that the Valley of the Kings is really a dry hole from this point forward. So in 1914, Davis retires, but it opens the door for Carter and Carnarvon, and they approach the Egyptian government and say, we would like the rights to dig in the Valley of the Kings. And because Davis has retired, they are granted that right. So let's go to the third member of our story, which is really the boy king, King Tut. But to understand the reign of King Tut and really who he is, we have to take a step back and look at his father. And his father's official name was Amenhotep IV. But Amenhotep IV changes his name to Akhenaten. Now, to understand what that means, and I've highlighted Aten at the end of the name, to understand Egypt is to understand its religion. And as we look at the religion of Egypt, there are multiple gods, multiple stories, and you might think of it like a pantheon, sort of like what they have in Greece. But where Greece has a pantheon of deities and they're all kind of related, Egypt has a pantheon of gods that are all different and unrelated. For instance, there is the god Re or the god Ra, depending on how you want to spell it. So the god Ra is really the sun. And the idea is that life and death are cyclical. And in the morning, the god Ra rises in the east, and the dung beetle pushes Ra across the sky during the course of the day, and then at night, the god Ra dies, only to be recreated the next morning. So that's one god. And then we have the Osiris-Horus myth. And Osiris, Horus, and Isis are gods where the god of the afterlife is Osiris, and his son Horus is the king. And then when the son Horus dies, he becomes Osiris, only to have the next son be Horus. And then we have Amun. Amun is the creator god and is perhaps the supreme god. And actually, Amun is the god of Thebes, where the Valley of the Kings is. And then we have the god Aten, which is not the sun, but the sun disk. So you have multiple religious stories, multiple gods. None of these gods are related, and yet the Egyptians felt that they could all go together. And even at some periods, the gods were combined. So instead of Re and Horus, they created a new god, Re Harakti. Or instead of Amun and Re, they create a new god, Amun Ra, which is a combined god of the two. And this didn't seem to bother most of the Egyptians until we get to Amenhotep IV. And Amenhotep IV sits down and goes, we have all of these God stories, and I think that there's really only one true God. That while we have been worshiping all of these different gods, and I've only touched the surface by talking about 4 or 5, they had hundreds of gods. And Amenhotep IV says there really is one God, and it is the sun. It's the sun disk. Aten is the one true God, and he changes his name from Amenhotep to Akhenaten. And as we look at it, it's he who serves. Aten is what that means. And he sits down and he says that if I am truly going to only worship one God, and if I am going to ask all of Egypt to worship only one God, then I have to close all the other temples. I have to fire all of the other priests. And we have to come together under one idea. And so if you look at a map of Egypt, in the north, where I have a little white arrow, is the city of Memphis. And Memphis in the north, just underneath the delta, which is the very rich land, farmland that was in Egypt, Memphis is where the kings would spend the summer months, that they were, this was really where the administrative capital of Egypt was located. And then if you go down to the south into this bend of the Nile River, we have Thebes. And Thebes is really the religious capital of Egypt. And Akhenaten says, if we're going to make this change, we really need to close both of those from a religious standpoint and create a new central site that will be solely devoted to Aten. And he creates a site called El Amarna in the middle. Now, if you think about it, if you in fact are worshiping one God, but the tradition of your country is to worship multiple gods, then you have now upset at least a third of the population, because the God that they liked is no longer allowed to be worshiped. You have also alienated all of the priesthood. So if we look at Akhenaten, he is not well thought of by the people. He also is more of a pacifist. And so the army begins to weaken. And that means that the prestige of Egypt weakens. So he is somebody who has a religious ideal, but in doing so throws the country into recession. And so he is not well thought of. But what he does have is perhaps the most beautiful wife in the history of the world. He marries a woman by the name of Nefertiti. And many of you have heard of her because her name even says the beautiful one has come. And it is thought that she may have been one of the most beautiful women in the history of the world. She's the daughter of a guy named Ai, who is the vizier, kind of the prime minister of Egypt. She comes from a wealthy ruling family. And when she marries Akhenaten, they begin together to worship the sun disk. As we look at the artwork of the two of them together, it shows that they had this wonderful relationship. And you can see how the sun disk is reaching down with little hands. In fact, those rays coming out of the sun have little hands on the ends that are reaching out. And you can see that they have 3 children together. And almost all of the iconography we see of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, they're playing with their daughters. So they have 3 daughters who they really love, but they have no sons. And it looks like the lineage may die out. And yet there is a secondary wife, perhaps named Kia, that he has a son with. And he names his son Tutankhamun, which is the living image of Aten. So he has a son by a second wife, and the son marries a daughter of a half-sister, a daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And at 9 years old, King Tut becomes king. So he is very much a boy king, and he has a general, someone we've mentioned before, Horemheb. And so Horemheb is his strong general and right hand. And then I, who is the father of Nefertiti, comes alongside of him as regent and is the administrative and priestly guide to King Tut. So King Tut is now a young boy, but he has enough wisdom even at 9 years old, where he relies heavily on Horemheb and I. And they come to him and they say, it's time to close El Amarna, and it is time to go back to our old ways. So on the left, you see a image of King Tut wearing the headdress of Amun. And he changes his name from Tutankhamun to Tutankhamun and reopens all of Amun's temples like Karnak in Thebes. He also goes to Memphis and he reopens the palaces in Memphis. And Re is worshipped in the north of the country. And he reopens all of the worship sites of Re. Horemheb, as his general, begins to reassert Egypt's power and prominence throughout the Levant and into Sudan, and creates Egypt as a military power again. So even though King Tut was young, he, through his regents, is able to grow the country and bring religious normalcy back. But at the age of 19, just 10 years into his reign, he dies. And people aren't sure how he died because the records are a bit conflicted. And jumping ahead just a little bit, when his body is found, there is a large hole in the back of the head. And the initial theories, when he was found in 1922, were that he must have been murdered somehow through an assassination attempt, and that was how he died. But archaeology has come a really long way. And in 2010, different scientists tested his tissue and found that he had a very strong strain of malaria. And it is quite possible that he died of malaria. But when CAT scanning was done, they found that, in fact, the blow to the head was post-mortem. So it happened after he died and was part of when they removed his brain for embalming and had nothing to do with his death. But then as they went through, they found that there was a fracture in his left leg, and that left leg fracture had not healed at all, which meant it was just a few days old. And so through modern archaeology, we were able to determine that in fact it was likely the fracture to the left leg combined with the malaria that caused his death at 19. Now, since I have a slide of kind of modern technology up, let me digress just a second and say that some of the most exciting new research in archaeology that we're doing today really comes from genetic work. For instance, as you look at King Tut, there were 3 different people who the written historical record off of tombs say that the father of Tutankhamun was, well, it could have been Amenhotep, which is who we now know it is, but there were 2 other individuals that were mentioned as possible fathers to King Tut. But because we can now do DNA testing, genetic testing, we now know definitively that Akhenaten is the father of King Tut. And much of what we're seeing, not just in Egyptian history, but in archaeology around the world, be it Roman or Native American Indian, we're learning through genetic testing so much more about history. So as we move through the next 10 years, I believe that you're going to see genetic testing be one of the biggest factors that we talk about in archaeology. So let's go back. We have these three individuals. Carter now working with Carnarvon in 2014. They have just gotten the concession to dig in the Valley of the Kings, replacing Theodore Davis, who has resigned. Carter again is now leading a dig, and they believe that King Tut may very well still be in the valley. But there's something ominous about this year, that as we look at 1914, that is the year that World War I begins. So just a matter of weeks after they start the dig in the Valley of the King, the world goes to war, and they're forced to stop all excavation. Now, if you think back to the TV show Downton Abbey, how is Downton Abbey or Highclere Castle used during World War I? Well, Lord Carnarvon goes back and they turn Highclere Castle into really a convalescent home for wounded officers who are returning from the war. So similar to what you see on TV is the truth about Highclere Castle. So as we look at Lord Carnarvon, he is really busy working with the war effort back in England. Howard Carter is attached to the British intelligence arm out of Cairo, and he becomes a translator and a painter during the war from 1914 to 1918. So all work on the Valley of the Kings stops. But after the war, so early in 1919, Carter and Carnarvon come back and they begin to work in the Valley of the Kings and begin to dig. And Carter has this new idea. He says, instead of just doing glory holes, instead of just trying to dig and because we think this might be a good spot, I'm going to develop a new archaeological method. We're actually going to put quadrants in place. And we're going to plot where all of the Tutankhamun finds have been, and we're going to grid by grid clear the area. We're not just going to jump around willy-nilly, but we're going to do this in a very systematic and methodical way. And as we dig, we're going to take painstaking slowness, and we're going to look at everything. We're going to plot it, we're going to record it, and we're going to develop a new kind of archaeology. So they're back at work. But by 1921, they've not made enough progress that Lord Carnarvon is satisfied. And he decides at the end of 1921 to stop. And he tells Carter that he has 2 months to wrap up the dig and begin to publish his work, but he's not going to be able to back Carter anymore. And he does this because he believes, first, that Tut probably isn't here, that Davis was probably right. That Tut just isn't in the Valley of the Kings. And he began to total up the money, and he found that he had done almost, in today's dollars, $10 million worth of digging in Egypt. And he just couldn't continue to spend his money that way. And also that Egypt had asked for and gained their independence from the British. And some senior wealthy British people had been assassinated. And so his thought was, maybe it's not great for me to be there. And then finally, there are financial pressures at home. He's wanting to spend his money in other ways. So he gives Carter just a few months to wrap up the season and finish. But if you think back to that dinner party where Carnarvon and Carter actually meet. And they sent that jar off to the Metropolitan to be analyzed. Well, now it's 10 years later, and Carter gets a phone call from New York. And they say, you know that jar you sent us? We've finally gone through it. And those are the embalming wrappers of King Tutankhamun. And if you found embalming wrappers from King Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings, then King Tutankhamun was buried in the Valley of the Kings, because where someone was embalmed was where they would have been entombed. And Carter's going, we just can't stop. There is no way that we can stop. And so he gets on a plane and he goes to England. And he meets with Carnarvon, and he says, I understand that you don't want to put any more money, but I believe that we can find this. And so if you're not going to fund this excursion, then write me a letter. Just send me back with a note that says you are handing over your authority to dig in the Valley of the Kings to me, and I'll do it. And Carnarvon has become friends with Carter, and he sits back and he records that. He looks at him and he thinks, if I give you the letter that allows you to dig there, you're going to go bankrupt in one season. I know you can't afford it. And so we'll do one more year. We'll just do one more year together. Pick your best spot and let's see if we can find something. So in 1922, he goes and he looks at the site and he says, all right, I've plotted everywhere that we have found anything to do with King Tut. And if you look at this red arrow, the red arrow points to the tomb of Ramses VI. And they knew they had found in this general area some of the Tutankhamun artifacts. He also knew that adjacent to the opening to Ramses VI's tomb, Theodore Davis had done some preliminary digging, and in it he found all of the workmen's huts who had worked on Ramses VI's tomb. And he stopped there and said, okay, well, here were the workmen's huts for what they had worked on, but he never dug under those huts. And Ramses VI is roughly 150 years after King Tut. So there is a chance that somewhere in that general area adjacent to Ramses VI's tomb could be an opening for King Tut. So he kind of draws a grid, and I have it here in shaded purple, where they wanted to be able to dig. And they start at Ramses VI's tomb and begin to work down from there. And that's what they've decided is going to be where they want to do it in this 1922 dig. And as they're digging, and they've only started, they're on day 3, they're beginning to dig from Ramses VI's tomb to the south, and a young boy who has been sent by his father to get some water for the workmen comes and he brings the pot of water and knocks it over. And when he knocks it over, it exposes a step. And Carter looks again, just like what he has done in the past. Carter looks and he thinks, we found a step, just like I found at Deir el-Bahri. We found a step that could lead to a tomb. And he's faced with so many of the same feelings that he had had years before when he was working with Davis, and they found the steps and they went down and they dug and they thought they had found a tomb that was intact, only to find that the tomb was empty. And so now he is faced with that same step, and he brings all the workmen together and they begin to dig step by step by step down. And they find the picture that you have here. And I think that one of the best ways to talk about this picture and the emotions that go with it are actually from Carter's own journal. So on November 4th, they find the step, and this is on Sunday, November 5th. And Carter writes, "Towards sunset, we had cleared down to the level of the 12th step, which was sufficient to expose a large part of the upper portion of a plastered and sealed doorway. Here before us was sufficient evidence to show that it really was an entrance to a tomb, and by the seals and to all outward appearance that it was intact. I examined this exposed portion of the sealed doorway and noticed that the only decipherable impressions of the seals were those of the well-known royal necropolis seal. With the evidence of these seals and the fact that the workmen's huts, which in all probabilities dated from the time of the construction of Ramses VI's tombs, were built over the mouth of the entrance of this newly discovered tomb, without apparently disturbing it, it was clear that its content would be undisturbed at least from the 20th dynasty. The seal impression suggested that it belonged to somebody of high standing, but at that time I had not found any indications as to whom. I made a small hole under the wooden lintel. A passage beyond was completely filled with stones and rubble up to its ceiling. Quite alone, save my native staff of workmen, to suddenly find myself, after so many years of toilsome work, on the verge of what looked like a magnificent discovery, an untouched tomb. With certain reluctance, I reclosed the small hole that I had made. I was much puzzled by the smallness of the opening in comparison to those of other royal tombs in the valley. Its design was certainly of the 18th dynasty. Could it be a tomb of a noble, buried there by royal consent? Or perhaps was it a royal cache? As far as my investigations had gone, there was absolutely nothing to tell me. I refilled the excavation for protection, and with my men selected for the occasion, they, like myself, delighted beyond all expectation. I returned home and cabled Lord Carnarvon the following message. At last, made wonderful discovery in the valley. A magnificent tomb with sealed intact. Recovered saying, for your arrival. Congratulations, H. Carter. So he's truly excited. I mean, he has found something that, again, he thinks could be a tomb that has never been disturbed before. But there are some problems. Is it a tomb? Or is it just a cache of objects that someone had placed? As he's looking at the doorway to it, it looks hurriedly done. It's full of rubble. It's smaller than many of the other doorways. So it could very well be a noble and not a pharaoh. And as you look at it, in this picture on the left, cut into the hillside, is the tomb entrance for Ramses VI. And if you go straight ahead, you see a flat space that is actually covering the opening of King Tut's tomb. So he's digging under someone else's tomb, which is kind of an odd spot, and part of the reason why it hadn't been found before. So Carnarvon makes it with his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert, about 2 weeks later. And they have waited for their arrival. And Lord Carnarvon arrives on November 23rd. Lady Evelyn arrives on the 24th. And they begin to reopen what they had dug before but covered. And they find this doorway. And this is an actual picture of the doorway before it was opened. And going back to Carter's notes on the 24th, in his diary he reads or writes, "Reached as far as the first doorway. There proved to be 16 steps. Now that the whole of the sealed doorway was laid bare, various seal impressions bearing the cartouche of Tutankhamun were discernible. In the upper part of the sealed doorway, traces of 2 distinct openings and successive reclosings were apparent, and that the seal impressions first noticed on November 5th of the royal necropolis had been used for that reclosing. Here was evidence of at least the reign of the tomb, but its true significance is still a puzzle. For in the lower rubbish that filled the staircase entrance, we found masses of broken potsherds, broken boxes, and latter bearing the names and protocol of Akhenaten, Smenkhare, Tutankhamun, as well as a fragment bearing the cartouche of Amenhotep III. These conflicting data led us to believe that we are about to open a royal cache of the Amarna period. Monarchs that from the evidence mentioned above, it had been probably opened and used more than once." So just kind of, again, imagine here he is, the highs and the lows. We have found something, perhaps it's a tomb, perhaps it has things behind the doorway, and he digs down, and as he looks at the rubble right in front of the doorway, he now finds a whole bunch of different kings mentioned who were earlier kings. And he had already seen that this doorway is too small to be a king's doorway. So it probably is just a room that had various items from various kings, a cache stored. But then even worse, even though the doorway is intact, it is clear that someone has broken through in the past, that some tomb robber or someone has been here. So imagine how now he feels. Even though the door is sealed, it is probably the case that there's nothing behind this door. And I brought everybody out. I would imagine he is feeling very much like he did when he did the Tomb of the Nobles, and he opened it up and there's nothing there. So we go 2 days later, and I'm going to do one last quick reading from one of his journals, and this is from Sunday, November 26th. And they've now named this Kings Valley Tomb 62. So this is the 62nd tomb that is found in the Valley of the Kings. And he writes, after clearing 27 feet of the descending passage. So he's broken through the first doorway here, and he had already found that the second passageway was full of rubble, as if to keep people out. So he's cleared 27 feet of the descending passage. In about the middle of the afternoon, we came upon a second sealed doorway, which was almost the exact replica of the first. It bore similar seal impressions and had similar traces of successive reopenings and reclosings in the plastering. The entrance and passage, both in plane and in style, resembled almost to the measurement the tomb containing the cache of Akhenaten's discovery by Davis in the near vicinity, which seemed to substantiate our first conjecture that we had merely found a cache. Feverishly, we cleared away the remaining last scrapes of rubbish on the floor of the passage before the doorway until we had only the clean, sealed doorway before us, in which, after making preliminary notes, we made a tiny breach in the top left-hand corner to see what was beyond. Darkness, and the iron testing rod told us that there was empty space. Perhaps this was another descending staircase in the accordance of the ordinary royal Theban tomb plan. Or maybe it's a chamber. Candles were procured, and all important telltale foul gases when opening an ancient subterranean excavation. I widened the breach, and by means of the candle looked in. While Lord Carnarvon and Lady Evelyn and my assistants waited with anxious expectation. And here you can see the little hole that he had made, and the idea was he's not going to make the same mistake he made before. He's not going to leave that door untouched. He wants to know what's on the other side. And at first, he says, I could see nothing. The hot air escaping from the chamber causing the candle flame to flicker. But presently, as my eyes grew accustomed to the light, details of the room within emerged slowly from the mist, strange animals, statues, and gold. Everywhere, the glint of gold. And he says that Carnarvon, standing next to him, anxiously says, "Can you see anything?" And Carter replied with the words, "Yes, wonderful things." And so they have now found the first and only ever discovered tomb of a king intact in Egypt. And these pictures are colorized, but these are actually the original pictures that they took in black and white as they entered. This one they have already put items to number, but the tomb was to be officially opened by the Egyptian Department of Antiquities on the 29th. And keep in mind what I was reading was the 26th. So they're not supposed to go in. However, on the 26th and 7th, Carter and his assistants and Lord Carnarvon and Lady Evelyn all made several unauthorized trips into the tomb and were able to see the beds and the gold and the chests that were there. In addition to these beds and other items in this first antechamber, there is a state-of-the-art chariot, a new design that historians had never seen before, that allowed for archers to be on the back of a chariot. So this find is not just a find of wealth, but it is also a find of history. And as you look at this picture, you'll see a bed in the back. And underneath that bed, it's full of items. They crawl under it, and they actually find a small passageway into yet another room that is full of items. So if we look at the steps on the right of this picture into chamber 1, that was full of rubble. Then they break into chamber 2, which has the beds and many items. If you go under the bed on the left, there is actually a small opening into another room. And then as they're standing, they look at this wall. And as you can see, there is clearly a doorway here, and it is being guarded by two individuals, or there are two representations of King Tut on either side. And what's on the other side of this? As you look at his notes, he actually thinks that this could be nothing, that there on the other side of that might just be more cash. But on the other side of it could also be a sarcophagus and the King Tut that they've been looking for. So they're instructed by the Egyptian government to actually wait 2 weeks before they go through and see what is on the other side. But as you look at this picture, you'll notice there are a bunch of twigs and a bowl sitting on the floor. And that looks a bit strange. And the reason why it looks strange is Carter is not, again, going to be embarrassed. So what he does is he creates a small hole in the lower right-hand corner of that doorway, and he and Carnarvon crawl through and discover that, in fact, King Tut's tomb is on the other side of this wall. But because they weren't supposed to go in, they cover it up with sticks, put a bowl in front of it, and make a small note that there was a small opening that we observed, but we didn't touch it until the Egyptian government comes alongside. Now, there is a little bit of a kerfluffle that comes up. Lord Carnarvon travels to England in December of 1922, returning in January of 23 to be present for the official opening of the inner burial chamber. But to recoup some of his losses, he actually sells an exclusive to the story to one paper for what is today's dollars, about $1 million. And that helped to have him recoup some of his financial losses on the trip. But the Egyptian newspapers come back and say that the reason he did this is it's indicative of his character, and that they're going to be classic tomb raiders, take all of these Egyptian artifacts and sell them on the open market. The Egyptian government is very concerned and actually shuts down the dig at that point for a period of time. So this is perhaps the beginning of fake news, where he is actually just trying to recoup money. And even though he says, I am not trying to take artifacts out of the country, he and the government get crosswise. So word spreads really quickly, and the entire world is fascinated by the story and the find of King Tut. And I would argue that, in fact, that continues today, because the King Tut exhibit that often travels the world has record-breaking attendance. But towards the end of February, a rift with Carter, probably caused by the disagreement on how to manage the information and the supervision of the Egyptian authorities, temporarily closes the excavation. Work resumed in early March after Carnarvon apologized to the Egyptian government. And this was to be Lord Carnarvon's last involvement with the excavation. On March 19th, 1923, Carnarvon suffers a severe mosquito bite, which became infected after a razor cut. And then on the 5th of April, he dies. And that really causes a tremendous amount of disruption for the next several months on how the excavation is going to be remembered and reused. For the next 10 years, Carter spends time cataloging, photographing, and recording everything in the tomb. In fact, there are over 5,000 items that are in the tomb, many of them either gold inlaid or solid gold. And one of these pieces is that as Pharaoh, your skin is thought to be gold. So everything, including in the lower right-hand corner, you see the sandals with the toes made of gold. Those were actually placed, the toes were placed on King Tut's toes, and the sandals were the sandals off of his body. Some of the most prized items were the gold and jeweled encrusted headpiece and the golden royal throne. The headpiece is made of lapis lazuli and gold and glass. It has the buzzard and the cobra of northern and southern Egypt. It is a true likeness of what King Tut looked like. And if you're ever able to go to Cairo and see the new museum that they have created, they have done an amazing job being able to restore and display all of the artifacts, or at least most of the artifacts that were found, including the sarcophagus, which, as I'd mentioned before, 500 pounds of gold. The tomb itself is such that you can now revisit it. It was closed a few years after the Arab Spring and has now reopened as of this year. It's been restored, and it has the sarcophagus for King Tut still in place. The walls record the Book of the Dead. This idea that death is merely a waypoint to the rest of your existence, that for thousands of years you are able to live in eternity in an afterlife. But to get there, there are several challenges that one needs to overcome. And so all of the walls and all of the sarcophagus have these answers to various questions that are in the Book of the Dead, so that King Tut would be able to ride on his royal bark or royal ship as he approached the afterlife and reach it so that he could live forever. And how I wanted to end today is a quote by King Tut, and it's not by something in gold. It's not by something on the walls. It is by a little cup, a cup that Carter had found, and across the rim of the cup was a saying. And this is the saying that Howard Carter has on his tombstone. And I think it's poignant. It says, may your spirit live. May you spend millions of years, you who love Thebes, sitting with your face to the north wind, your eyes beholding happiness. And I think that simple saying really describes the life of Carter and the life of Tut and the life of Lord Carnarvon. That they all had this love of Egypt. They all had this desire to make a difference. And they all loved Thebes. And so as we look at these three, may your eyes behold happiness. I think that all three ended with a happy life. And the discovery of King Tut and the story of how and who discovered this tomb, I think is one that warms the heart and shows us that mysteries sometimes come out well. Thank you for joining me for Viking.TV, and I look forward to seeing you on a Viking ship as resident historian. Have a great day.